If someone confessed their crime, they would get tortured by the garrote. The victim was locked into a seat with his back against a flat surface or a metal rod. His neck was strapped with leather string or a metal band, attached to a wheel or crank in the back. The wheel would turn so his neck was crushed agonizingly slowly, eventually suffocating him to death. Variations of the garrote included a spike or blade which would penetrate the spine as the wheel turned to break the neck quicker or sever the spinal column. The kill was quick and silent, both appealing traits when you've got lots of people to torture.
The Tenzu was useful for crushing fingers, which not only delivered an extreme amount of pain, but the process could be repeated a generous amount of times. This was mostly given to women who refused to work.
If women deliberately miscarried their babies, they would get the Spanish spider. Victims were pierced by the heated claws on their breasts, belly or buttocks, and then hung from the ceiling. Their own weight caused the wound and skin to stretch, and bleeding was near impossible to stop. People died hours after they were first suspended off the ground.
The victim was tied to a table where an incision was made to his abdomen, wide enough for the torturer's hand to fit inside. His small intestine was then separated from the bottom of the stomach with a hook and attached to a crank. Slowly the crank would turn, pulling out the intestine from the gut inch by inch. The victim and those witnessing the torture would see anywhere between 9 to 18 feet collect around the shaft of the crank. As you can see, the victim was tied to a table where an incision was made to his abdomen, wide enough to fit the torturer's hand inside. The crank would slowly turn, pulling the intestines out. The rack is a wooden frame with a roller at each end. Prisoners were strapped onto the mock table to keep from squirming, as their wrists and ankles were tied to a roller. They then began to turn in opposite directions, stretching out the body slowly until their joints were dislocated. This was a method used to gather information or confessions. Many prisoners had to watch other men suffer through the rack to implant a physiological fear in them prior to their own torture. There was no point the prisoners confessing anyway, because no one survived the crank. People died from a combination of extreme pain and blood loss. Additionally, the whip was the first man-made object that could break the sound barrier. Let me repeat that, so it can sink it. The crack of the whip is actually a small sonic boom. Remember, these objects were, and in some places still are, used on people as punishment. Strikes were so severe that pieces of flesh were torn right off, and losing an eye in the process was common. Victims would lose so much blood it was normal to fall into a state of hypovolemic shock. Wearing the Scold's Bride was far from a private affair. Women were taken through town led by a leash for people to see and know of their transgressions, so that she may be ridiculed for them. If the verbal assaults weren't enough, women were stoned and beaten by the town people. The heretic's fork, as you may have guessed, was usually primarily during the various inquisitions. The fork was a metal rod with two prongs at both ends attached to a leather strap worn around the neck. The top fork was placed on a fleshly part under the chin, while the other end dug into the bone of the sternum, keeping the neck stretched and the head erect at all times, ensuring optimal agony was simple. A person wearing the heretic's fork was kept from lying down by either being hung from the ceiling or suspended in some manner that proved distressing. Now, the question is, do you think that they got treated bad back in the day, or do you think those torture devices should still be around to teach the prisoners a lesson?